Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry about the delay. I have been panicking somewhat here, trying to get the new studio set up. Hello, welcome to Listen with Vobes. I am Richard Vobes, and this is the new studio. Nice to see you on the 3rd of... Is it the 3rd? I'm losing track of time. The 3rd of May 2021, 4 o'clock in the UK, or just after. And sorry about the light in my glasses. I haven't managed to set them up in the right place as yet. So apologies for that. We are live. I am so stressed. And I have been running around like a blue-ass fly. Anyway, this is the new studio. It's not quite right. My live button. It's not working. It's not working. It's dead. I think it's dead. I think it's died. And it's a shame because I need lights on that side of the studio. Anyway, I'm still trying to work on how to darken the studio and get all the effects I want. But, oh my God, it's been a nightmare. Anyway, never mind all that nonsense. You don't want to know about that. I'm going to try and read. I may give up. Because A, I'm so tired, B, I'm so stressed, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to cope, but I will do my best for you. I completely forgot until about half an hour ago that there was a reading show today. I kept thinking I was all right for another 4 hours till 8 o'clock. I kept thinking it was Sunday, but it's not Sunday. I don't even know if the camera is focused, so apologies for that. But I suddenly thought, oh my God, I've got to do the reading show. So here we are. Chapter 83, ladies and gentlemen. Normally I've got a light here to come down so I can actually see the words, but I haven't had a chance to fix that up yet. So we are what we are. Doris or no Doris, defeat or defeat in Europe, Mr. Josser had ordered the moving men for next Thursday. And unless he did something about it, they would be turning up round about 10:30. The trouble was that he didn't know what Mrs. Josser really wanted. She had told him so many times to cancel the move altogether, and then, at the last moment, had withdrawn the cancellation, that Mr. Josser still had an uneasy feeling in his mind, not knowing whether he was going or staying. Thursday was simply a glowing question mark set in the uncertain future. At the moment, it looked like they were going. Mrs. Josser had spent the whole of the morning turning out the cupboard and examining, with the peculiarity rapt expression of a woman who is planning something, the curtain lengths and odd bits of carpet that she found there. But she couldn't be sure. It might simply be the apartments in Dulcimer Street that she was thinking of doing up a bit. There was, he supposed, always the possibility that the moving men might solve everything, simply by forgetting about it. After all, it was some time now, over 3 weeks, since he had written to the firm, and in those 3 weeks such a lot had been happening. Enough to put things like furniture removals out of anybody's mind. At this rate, Lord only knew what things would be like by the time next Thursday came along. There wasn't a Holland anymore. The Dutch C&C had simply given up, and the Queen Wilhelmina and Princess Juliana were in London. Not that Belgium looked like lasting much longer, or France for that matter. You could always tell the way things had gone from bad to worse in those 4 days because Mr. Eden had spoken on the wireless and made an appeal for volunteers, local defence volunteers. It was obvious that even the steady ones were getting rattled now. And in the fate of all this, Mr. Josser had a strange, deep, guilty feeling about leaving London at all. It was too much like those people who were packed off to America at the beginning of the war. At this moment there seemed something fairly disloyal and rattish about even going as far as Essex. It was like walking out on your own family when things looked as though they were going wrong. Thursday had come. It was a question mark no longer. Mrs. Josser had made up her mind. A night-time cough of Mr. Josser's had been decisive, and they were going. The farewells had all been said, and the loaded moving van was waiting outside. Mrs. Josser, her hat on, was ready to depart. Now that the moment for leaving Dulcimer Street had actually come, she was feeling completely flat and dispirited. She couldn't imagine why she had allowed herself to be persuaded into this thing. The bare floors of what had once been their comfortable living room sent echoes up as she walked across them, and the discoloured shapes on the walls where pictures had been brought tears to her eyes. The whole business of moving seemed once more ridiculous, untimely, and ill-advised. For 2 pins, she repeated. She would cancel everything, even now, send Mr. Josser a wire telling him not to stand about waiting at the cottage for her to arrive, and ask the removers to carry all the stuff back upstairs. She wished now that she hadn't let Mr. Josser go on ahead. It seemed such a good idea at the time that he should hare off immediately after breakfast and have the rooms aired and the kettle boiling. It had been his idea anyway. She recognised now, however, that she needed him. If Doris could have been there, it would have been all right. But that was out of the question because Doris was at the office. Even Cynthia would have been better than no one, or would have been up until last night. As it was, things in that quarter had finally come to a head, with faults, no doubt, on both sides. At the last moment, on the very eve of departure, in fact, Mrs. Josser had suddenly decided that Mr. Josser had been right and that it was her duty to have Cynthia and baby at the cottage with them. Overcrowding or not, it was her duty, and Cynthia had refused. Refused point blank. The rejection of the offer, and above all the reason for the rejection, had hurt Mrs. Josser profoundly. She told Cynthia as much, and then Cynthia said that baby wouldn't feel like it, wouldn't feel free in anybody else's house, and Mrs. Josser's visit, embarked upon in a mood of Samaritan compassion, ended in recriminations. The memory of it came back to her. The memory of it came back to her at this moment, and raising her hand, she brushed away a tear. She had, after all, only been trying to do her duty. She was still standing there by the bare window without its curtains, looking down at the large deck-like top of the moving van, when there was a knock at the door, and Mrs. Vizard came in. Mrs. Josser felt both ashamed and relieved. Ashamed because she'd been crying, and relieved because it was another human being. She faced Mrs. Vizard. "I think you'll find it all in order," she said. "There's some paper in the grate, but apart from that, I've cleared up everything." "Oh, I'm sure you have, Mrs. Josser," Mrs. Vizard answered. "I wouldn't like you not to." It wouldn't be like you not to. "Thank you, Mrs. Vizard." It was a formal, absurdly formal conversation between the two women who had known each other for as long as they had, and it was one of those conversations that cannot easily go on. "I'm sorry to be going," Mrs. Josser said at last. "Very sorry, in a way." "I'm sorry to lose you," Mrs. Vizard answered. "It'll leave a gap." There was another pause. "What I really came up about," Mrs. Vizard explained, "was to ask whether you'd come down for a cup of tea before you go off." "Oh, that's very kind of you. Very kind of you." There was still the same formality about the conversation. Altogether, it was more like two strangers meeting than two old friends parting. And there was a reason for it. In her present state, Mrs. Josser just didn't trust herself to say very much. She took one last look around the room and silently followed Mrs. Vizard downstairs. It was the hot tea served, Mrs. Josser noticed, in Mrs. Vizard's best china that broke down the awkwardness and restraint. The conversation got round at last to Mr. Squales. Over a second cup, Mrs. Vizard looked up suddenly. £37 was what he cost me," she announced. £37.10, including 3 loans and a dinner jacket. Mrs. Josser drew in her breath. "Well, it doesn't bear thinking about," she said. Mrs. Vizard dropped her eyelids. "I often wonder," she said, what Mr. V would have thought of me. It was his money." As she spoke, she lifted her head and regarded the 3/4 portrait of Mr. Vizard. But there was nothing there to provide a clue. The face, with its half-rainbow of moustache, wore the same expression of solid failure that it had worn for nearly 30 years. There was even a suggestion in the hang-dog look of the eyes that he was past caring. "You can only thank Providence it wasn't more," Mrs. Josser told her. "It nearly was," Mrs. Vizard answered. "He wanted an overcoat." "The peacock!" The words slipped out of Mrs. Josser's lip almost before she was aware of them. But Mrs. Vizard didn't hear. She was simply staring into space, her lips moving. It was almost as though she were silently adding up something, and then, suddenly, she spoke. "Not that I shan't get it back when I find him, and more besides. If this lady friend wants him, she's got to pay." Mrs. Vizard checked herself abruptly. It was difficult to sound vindictive without also sounding vulgar. But Mrs. Josser was only looking across at her admiringly. "I respect you more than I can say," she told you. "Most women in your place would simply have gone to pieces." Mrs. Vizard was looking at her husband's portrait again. "So should I if it hadn't have been for him," she said. "I owe it to his memory to get every penny I can. Mr. Barks thinks so too." There was a pause. Mrs. Josser glanced up uneasily at the cabinet clock on the mantelpiece. "It's time I was off, Mrs. Vizard," she said. "That cup of tea was just what I needed, but I really must be going now. I don't want Fred putting up all the things in the wrong places." "I'll come up with you, just to see you off," Mrs. Vizard answered. In the hall, they met Mr. Puddy. He was just coming in from shopping. He presented a blurred, indefinite outline because of the paper bags. He stood back for Mrs. Josser to pass. "Ta-da for the last time," he said. There was a sinister note of finality, of doom almost, in his voice that disturbed Mrs. Josser. "Not the last time," she said. "You're coming down to see us." But Mr. Puddy only shook his head doubtfully. "If the trades are still running," he said. If there is a total war by then." To cover up the gloom of Mr. Puddy, Mrs. Josser turned and kissed Mrs. Vizard. It was the first time that the two women had ever kissed. In normal times, they probably would never have done so, but these weren't normal times. Mrs. Josser and Mrs. Vizard faced each other again. and that they had faced each other. Mrs. Josser and Mrs. Vizard had faced a lot together, and remembering Mr. Puddy's words, Mrs. Vizard might still be facing it. It was terrible leaving her here, alone, betrayed, ageing and defenceless. Mrs. Josser pulled herself together. "Say goodbye to Connie for me," she said. "Tell her I'm sorry I've missed her." "Bist her?" Mr. Puddy repeated incredulously. "She's got ahead." There was silence. "She's done what?" Mrs. Josser demanded. "Got ahead," Mr. Puddy answered. "I saw her in the van with the driver." So she has already gone ahead. Sorry, I'm reading absolutely dreadfully, but then I can't. I can understand why. Chapter 84. It was now... Excuse me, my throat is full of dust. What time does that say? It was silent nowadays in Dulcimer Street. Suddenly It was silent nowadays in Dulcimer Street. Suddenly and unnaturally silent. The tall, pale, stucco house was full of echoes and bare rooms. It might have been the household of ghosts over which Mrs. Vizard was presiding. Not that she was doing her best to repeople it with flesh and blood. On the contrary, as soon as she had properly realised that the Jossers were going, her mind at the time had still remained utmost in difficulty in apprehending even the simplest of facts, and kept returning inescapably to Mr. Squales. And she had advertised the rooms. And she had taken the precaution of recurtaining the Jossers' front windows and the blooms so that the house shouldn't appear to be going downhill. If the place once looked like if the place once looked the deserted human derelict that it was, it might, and this was the real terror, become unlettable. But in May 1940, it needed more than curtains at the windows to let rooms in London. Everyone who could get out, the aristocracy of places like Streatham and Golders Green, the real local cream, was going. It was now evacuation, a second exodus, and those who remained, the real Londoners who belonged there, weren't in any mood for going. They were just holding their breaths and sitting tight. And there was another difficulty so far as number 10 was concerned. There was such a lot of it to be let. Mr. Squales' room, the Boones, the Jossers. She couldn't, Mrs. Vizard decided, insert just one advertisement to cover the whole lot. It would make her look like a wholesale. It would make her look wholesale like an agency. That would be fatal for the kind of tenant that she wanted. There was nothing for it, therefore, but to advertise the suites one by one with discretion. And that was terrible. Advertisements simply ran away with money. Sorry, itchy nose. It was because of her panic about money that she was so implacable in her pursuit of Mr. Squales. Not of Mr. Squales himself, of the rich woman who had enticed him. If Mrs. Vizard, jilted and unprotected, was to be forced to sit out the war in Kennington alone, she was going to make sure that somebody would pay for her. That was why she made frequent visits to Mr. Barks to see how his investigation was getting on. But, like the advertisements, it all cost money. She returned each time from Mr. Barks' office, her palms damp and sticky, thinking of the bills to which her impatience was committing her. Taken all in, however, it was the silence, particularly at night when both Connie and Mr. Puddy were at work, that was the worst. It was then that Mrs. Vizard remembered how full, how lively Miss Number 10 had always been. Remembered and wept. She might have been living through the first days of widowhood again, and from the way she recalled the Dulcimer Street of last month, it was as though Mrs. Josser, tight-lipped and steel-spectacled, had been accustomed to keeping the whole household awake into the small hours with lyrics and snatches of gay song. Without the Jossers, there was desolation. And with only three of them, Mrs. Vizard, Connie and Mr. Puddy, in the whole house, they tended, irresistibly and inevitably, to come together. In some mysterious fashion, prompted possibly by a consciousness of the brooding of universal danger, they cohered. As the news from France got worse, and this was happening all the time, they became one family. Within a fortnight of the Jossers' departure, Mrs. Vizard, to her own astonishment, found not only that she could now tolerate Connie's company, but that she actually looked forward to her visits. And to Mr. Puddy's. She sat there in her front basement sitting room, listening for the step on the stairs, either a mincing, tripping one, or a good, solid, monumental tramp. It was naturally Connie who came in more frequently. She looked in most mornings around 11, when there was usually a cup of tea and perhaps a dry biscuit going. And it is a tribute to her common sense that she did not abuse the privilege. Recognising her new status for the promotion that it was, she carefully kept the conversation to painless and uncontroversial subjects, like the war or the Jossers Cottage Company. The Jossers County Cottage. For the time being, she avoided all reference to Mr. Squales. In the result, Mrs. Vizard had heard half a dozen times already how Connie, if she had her way, would land the whole British Army and the Navy and the Air Force right on the coast of Germany and tell them to fight their way to Berlin instead of trying to defend France, and how she was convinced that the walk to the village was going to be too much for Mr. Josser. On the latter, she spoke as an expert and an authority. Mr. Puddy was quite right. It was Connie he had seen on the van that day. Defying everyone, even the driver, she had gone the whole way to Ditchfield. Had Mr. Josser been surprised to see her, she had stopped there as long as she could, and it was only that she had to get a lift back in the same van as soon as it was empty that prevented her greeting Mrs. Josser on arrival. That and the fact that she didn't know how Mrs. Josser would take it. But even if Connie's repertoire was limited, it was better in a way than what Mr. Puddy had to offer. He always had something fresh and disquieting. Sitting up there in his top flat, his ear pressed against the wireless set for any scraps of battle news that the thing might impart to him, he terrified himself. And when it was too much to be borne alone, he would come down and tell Mrs. Vizard. "It's all up," he would announce, breathing heavily and emphatically. "You could tell that from the wireless, what the wireless says. It's over. It's over there now. It was a dent. Now it's a bulge. There's nothing can stop them. The French aren't dying probably. What? The French aren't drying probably any longer." Oh, they're not trying. Okay. Sorry, it's written phonetically like this, so sometimes it's hard to actually understand what he's saying. "The French aren't trying probably any longer. It's all up. Arthur next." Despondently, and Mr. Puddy had become practically... despondency and Mr. Puddy had become practically synonymous. Despondency and Mr. Puddy had become practically synonymous. Sorry, struggling a bit today, Oh dear. It is dark, and drizzling and bitterly cold. The sea, which was choppy earlier, has quietened down by now, but the little waves still slap spitefully against the windward side of the vessel. In the lee, another and smaller vessel is moored. It is a rubber dinghy. 2 seamen are trying to hold it in position while a third lowers something into it. It isn't easy. It is the first place. In the first place, the side of the submarine bulges so far out that the dinghy is at more than arm's length for the stanchion that the seaman is holding onto. Secondly, because it's dark and because he isn't allowed to show even a glimmer from a torch, he cannot see what he's doing. And finally, the thing that he's holding is awkward and intractable. Part of it keeps swinging round and hitting him. It is a bicycle. Part of it keeps... I've read that. A second-hand BSA with a Brooks saddle and a Dunlop Magnum tyres. Then up the ladder of the conning tower climbs the captain, with Otto Haffel after him. Otto Haffel is muffled up in standard-issue oilskins with a big sou'wester and rubber boots. Underneath it, he's got on a Burberry raincoat, a suit with a Simpson label, a pair of Lillian Skinner shoes and Woolsey socks and underwear. His hat comes from Dunn's. Everything about him is typically English, and everything has a carefully well-worn appearance. He wore his going-away clothes right through the intensive 6 weeks course. They're a bit bulky under the oilskin, but they're his uniform now. It's going to be no panic in that dinghy, and even with the tide in his favour all the way, he's got a 3.5-mile row ahead of him. Also, he's got exactly 2 hours with which to do it. 2 hours until dawn, that is. Before he climbs in, he checks the contents of the dinghy. But he needn't worry. The Navy is always efficient. Everything is there. His rations, his compass, his little parcel of belongings in the fibre suitcase, his smuggled copy of last Wednesday's Daily Mail, his bicycle. He's got all that he would need for his English holiday. Then he turns and shakes hands with the captain. "Auf Wiedersehen," he says. "Auf Wiedersehen," the captain answers. "Heil Hitler." "Heil Hitler." Both arms go up and Otto Haffel turns away. He is momentarily glad that it is dark. This is because he is so much moved. There are tears in his eyes, and he doesn't want the captain to see them. It's very tricky getting into the dinghy, but not entirely unfamiliar. He's been attending special dinghy classes, though naturally this is a bit different. This is the real thing, and he's trembling as he takes up the sculls. With one of them, he pushes himself away from the side, and immediately the outline of the submarine fades into the surrounding darkness. Otto Haffel is alone. Alone in the German Ocean. The Scottish coast lies somewhere ahead of them. He wonders whether he'll ever get to it, and if he does get there, he wonders if he will get away again. In the darkness and the rain, with the spray freezing as it flecks onto him, he remembers not his mother, or his Führer, or the mission that brings him there, or even his own danger. None of these. He remembers the Colonel General's last words to him. "In spring, England is very beautiful. It is a flower garden." He tries to say the words over and over to himself as he tries to prevent the dinghy from going round in circles. It seems such a long time since war was declared, and he was sitting up in the gallery making notes on the South London Parliament. We're on Chapter 5. Chapter 85, I beg your pardon. What am I talking about? Chapter 5, that old rubbish that is. There was still, however, at least one man in England without a care on his head. There was Mr. Squales. The improvement in the condition since his stay in the country had been remarkable. Truly remarkable. For a start, he was sleeping better, and because of all the exercise he was getting going. And because of all the exercise he was getting going round the garden with Mrs. Jan Bill, he was eating better. He was even drinking better. His appearance, too, had improved, though that may have been simply because Mrs. Jan Bill had persuaded him to wear his hair just a little shorter, and now only a 2-inch lock that fell over his forehead when he leant forward. And in the result, both she and Mr. Squales had been repaid. He looked a new man, almost like his own younger brother. In face of such rejuvenation, why should he worry? It was like being 20 again, and there wasn't a hitch anywhere. The banns had been read the 3 necessary times, and no one had objected. The church had been booked, and the matter of the ring, which might have been awkward, had been solved by Mrs. Jan Bills generously insisting that it should be ordered from her own jeweller and put down on her account. In the circumstances, he had gone all out for platinum, but it was the thought that he told himself rather than the value of the thing that mattered. And in this he found it strangely touching that Mrs. Jan Bill should have shown him such understanding. But there it was. She adored him, and there was no blinking the fact. She had even spoke of building him a little den, a kind of Swiss chalet in the grounds, so that he could continue his work undisturbed when visitors came. The idea still amused him, but he had thanked her at the time for thinking of it. Indeed, life at the moment was one long thank you. He positively had to be careful not to admire too much things that he didn't like, because they were almost invariably given to him. But the sense of freedom, the escape from want, was marvellous. It was that made him feel so much better in himself, better and ready for anything, ready even for tomorrow. Because of the occasion, Mr. Squales took particular pains with his toilet. He had brought himself a bottle of rose-based scalp stimulator, and he spent nearly 5 minutes rubbing the stuff into his scalp before he started shaving. And then he began lathering himself patiently and laboriously like a barber. In consequence, it was a good shave for the first time round, but not good enough with his hair as dark as his. He'd still look like an Italian... Hang on, got to sneeze. Hey, sneeze! I beg your pardon. Oh, sorry about that. I need to blow the old hooter. I tell you one thing, it's bloody cold in this studio. Doesn't warm up. I don't think the windows properly close. I'll have to sort that out. Oh, it's chilly. If Julia's watching, bring a coat. You're going to need it. Where was I? Oh yes, if he wasn't careful, he'd look like an ice cream vendor. So he re-lathered and started again, and this time he cut himself. A great 3-cornered snick came out of the centre of his chin, and he had to staunch the wound with a tuft of cotton wool. We'll have to do something about this, he said, examining himself in the mirror. Can't turn up at the church looking like the Snow Queen. The cut gave him more trouble than he had expected. By the time he'd finished dressing, he had spoilt the pale silk necktie, which he had bought especially for the wedding, and ruined 2 good collars. In the end, there was nothing for it but to trim up one of his old ones by going round the edges with a pair of nail scissors, and wear the tie that he had come down in. He didn't like doing so because it made him feel rather a cad. That tie had been one of the first presents that Mrs. Vizard had gave him. The unwelcome memory of Mrs. Vizard at such a moment unnerved him, and he shuddered. Between his past fiancée and his present bride, there was such a gap, such a vast, unbridgeable gap. It was really quite extraordinary to think that they were both women. Not that he felt unequal to his new station in life, the station of a country gentleman. He was quite sure of himself there. Before the month was out, he would have cured the butler of breathing down his nose every time he looked at him. No, it wasn't that. It was simply Mrs. Janbill's size that was worrying him. When he was actually with her, he didn't notice it so much. It was all of a piece somehow. Large house, large car, large woman. But looked at in prospect, she was enormous. Simply enormous. Marrying her seemed to take on a new significance. It was like uniting himself for life with the Taj Mahal or the Leaning Tower. It was a bit late, however, for any misgivings. Mr. Squales recognised that. Already it was nearly 9 o'clock, and he went downstairs to breakfast. Usually he ate a good breakfast, porridge, kidneys, toast, marmalade, everything. But this morning his mind was too full to concentrate on food, too full to concentrate on anything. Sitting with the untasted wheat flakes in front of him, he found himself drifting off into one of those dangerous psychic states of his. It seemed that Mrs. Vizard was very near to him again, right up beside his elbow, and was trying to say something. It was as though he could feel that her lips were moving, yet not hear a syllable that she said. He roused himself finally with a groan which startled the waitress, and he went outside to walk in the garden. It was only a small garden, and he went round and round several times. Oh yes, because he's staying at that hotel, isn't he? That's right, I forgot. Poor woman, he kept repeating to himself as he walked. I can understand how she feels. It must be terrible for her, especially at her time of life. I must make it my business to see her sometime, if only to console her. Mr. Squales peered in at the clock in the dining room as he passed. Mrs. Janbill was giving him a watch for a wedding present, and he saw that it was 9:30. The car was coming for him, as usual, at 10, and it was his business to be ready for it. Leaving the placidity of the garden behind, they can easily bung on an extra quid or two if they need. They can easily bung on another quid or two a week if they had an orchestra or loudspeaker and served meals under the umbrellas, he told himself, and then he went back upstairs to his bedroom. Mr. Vizard's Gladstone bag, limp and rather sinister-looking, stood in the rack at the end of the bed, and Mr. Squales bundled his things into it. Then he caught sight of the tuft of cotton wool adhering to his chin. It had slipped down a little and now rode there like a little goatee, giving him the air of a swarthy federal general. He whipped it off in irritation, and in consequence he was still mopping his chin when the car came for him. And what was worse is that he had used his last clean handkerchief. God. The fact of this upset him. It seemed so absurd to have a clean handkerchief. It seemed so absurd not to have a clean handkerchief on his own wedding day. What upset him more, however, was that it was the Morris, practically a market wagon driven by the gardener that had come to collect him. The Rolls-Royce driven by the chauffeur was standing by to carry Mrs. Janbill and the best man. He had arrived in the Morris with the gardener, and that was enough to upset anyone. To begin with, he was practically a stranger. When Mr. Squales had told Mrs. Jan Bill that he was literally friendless in England because he had spent so much time abroad, and compared to Withydean, Brighton was, so to speak, abroad, he had not imagined that, in addition to everything else, she would go to the length of giving him a friend. But this was what had happened. She had rounded up someone simply to be Mr. Squales' companion for the day. So far as Mr. Squales could make out, all that was expected of the newcomer was that he would stand at the altar rail and pass the ring over at the right moment. But even that seemed something of a tax of his powers. He was a small, sallow-complexioned, colonial servant who had been invalided home, and the reason for his premature retirement was obvious to Mr. Squales at a glance. There was something slightly wrong with the poor fellow's brain. He didn't speak very often. He just sat looking on and smiling. His only hobby, so far as Mr. Squales could discover, was playing bridge. And when Mr. Squales, trying to be friendly, said that he was thinking of taking up the game himself and asked for a few tips, the ex-colonial servant only smiled again. Not to put too fine a point on it, Mr. Squales hated him. Had hated him from the first, and he hated him still more this morning when he saw that he was wearing tails. Tails was the one thing in which Mr. Squales' armoury was incomplete. "Do I look all right in a lounge suit?" he asked, just as they were setting out. "My morning dress is in town. I forgot to send up for it." But the invalided Waller did nothing to reassure him. He only smiled. And such a broad smile, too. It was as if he was not smiling at all, but laughing. The wedding was pretty, as only country weddings can be. The little church had been decorated throughout with Mrs. Jan Bill's favourite colours, dark red roses, and as Mr. Squales noted appreciatively out of the corner of his eyes, there had hardly been room for another bloom anywhere. They were in vases on the window-sills, hanging down the baskets in the chancel, crawling in spirals down the pillars. The whole church resembled a mock ecclesiastical side chapel in a high-class West End florist. But it was not at the flowers alone that Mr. Squales was looking. After the first flattered glance, his eyes fastened themselves on the assembled congregation. So far, every man there was dressed in shapely black tails with a vivid white rim of collar showing. Mr. Squales, radiant in his pearl grey, turned his head away and looked up, his place inconspicuously behind a screen. Mr. Squales, radiant in his pearl grey, turned his head away and took up his place inconspicuously behind a screen in the side aisle. He was still thinking bitterly about the array of tails. "I bet they're all hired, the whole damn lot of them," he told himself, in an attempt at consolation. There's no and. As there was nothing to do for the next few minutes, Mr. Squales, whistling almost silently between his teeth, took further stock of the interior. Judging from the music spread out along the choir stalls, the service was going to be fully choral. Evidently Mrs. Jan Bill had seen to that. He was still feeling grateful to her for all the trouble that she had taken to make the whole thing a success, when an enormous peal from the organ, he was practically leaning against the side of it, made him jump backwards. It had the alarming note of doom, that organ peal. Mr. Squales wasn't prepared for it, and his nerves were all on edge anyway. While the organ was playing, more and more cars kept drawing up outside, and more men in tailcoats, accompanied by women with remarkable hats, came trooping in. Mr. Squales was still the only man present in a lounge suit. It was while he was standing there that a little incident occurred that, despite his polish, he found difficult to pass off smoothly and gracefully. It had something to do with the seating. Up to now, only the pews on one side had been occupied, and these were getting unhealthily congested. As soon as anyone arrived fresh, the others had to move up one. When things had clearly become impossible, the verger came creeping up the side aisle and plucked the best man by the sleeve. "Excuse me, sir," he whispered loudly, "but there isn't anyone sitting on the bride's. But there isn't any more sitting room on the bride's side. Are any friends of the bridegroom coming?" While he was standing there, Mr. Squales couldn't help hearing every word that the verger had to say, and he couldn't help hearing the best man's reply. "Better ask the bridegroom," was what the friend of Mrs. Jan Bill had picked for him to reply, and that inane smile broke out on his face again. "Ask the bridegroom?" Mr. Squales half closed his eyes and put on his wonderful two-piece smile, first the cheeks wrinkling and then his lips opening slowly. "Put the guests wherever you please," he said magnanimously. "Any friend of Mrs. Jan Bill is a friend of mine." But the humiliation of the episode remained. There seemed to be something so ridiculously naked in not having even a single friend in the whole company. It was like being an orphan. Anyone would have been better than no one. For 2 pints, he would have asked Connie. Connie. Mr. Squales' stomach went icy inside him. In the third pew on the bride's side was a fair-sized figure in bright gorget trim with tufts and white rabbit wool. On its head was a schoolgirlish straw hat supporting a bobbing bunch of red cherries, and beneath the hat showed a fringe of frizzed magenta hair. Mr. Squales, his jaw dropped, stood sitting. Mr. Squales, his jaw dropped, stood there staring at the vision, and to his horror he realised that the vision was beaming back at him. But before he was able to step back behind the cover of one of the pillars, the vision had even managed to blow a rather saucy kiss in his direction. "My God," Mr. Squales reflected wildly, "I know what this means. This is blackmail. She has been shadowing me." There was no time for further thought, however. With a whir from the electric bellows, the organ started up again. "Tum, tum, ta-tum, tum, ta-dum, tum, tum, ta-dum," it went. 8 scrubbed and polished urchins from the village opened their lungs. The best man gave Mr. Squales a nudge, rather an unnecessarily hard nudge, Mr. Squales thought, and Mrs. Jan Bill, in white satin, followed by 2 tiny morsels, also dressed in white satin, with dark red rosebuds in their hair, forged up the aisle. In white satin, Mrs. Jan Bill looked absolutely prodigious. And there we leave it until tomorrow, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, we can do one more bit, because I thought that was, when then we get to the end of the chapter, we must do this. The reception was held at Withy-Dean afterwards. The French doors of the morning room had been thrown back, making one large salon. And through the gay throng, bowler-hatted generals, pensioned civil servants, and retired city men, Mr. Squales passed, sagging his bride on one arm. He was It was a bit of a strain, this, he didn't mind admitting, meeting all these friends of his wife for the first time. So much depended on the kind of impression that he made. In consequence, he decided to be quiet, genial, self-deprecating. It was difficult because, really, he was still thinking about Connie and wondering how much she wanted. "To the bride and the bridegroom," suddenly a large, well-meaning man from that Mr. Squales had never seen before said. Immediately all the glasses were raised, and there was a generous unanimity about the gesture. It meant that now they could all take a good long drink of champagne instead of simply sipping at it surreptitiously. "Mr. and Mrs. Squales," they said in a chorus. With everyone standing facing him, Mr. Giles recognised this for his moment. It was now or never that he would be able to convince them what a decent, unassuming sort of fellow he was. He took his wife's arm in his. "No, no," he said modestly. "Mr. and Mrs. Jan Bill." And there we leave it, with chapter 86 awaiting us, and still quite a few pages to go. Maybe two more sessions of reading to get through. Whew. Anyway, there we go. Hope you enjoyed that. I am freezing cold now. I don't know why it's so cold in this room, but there it is. Anyway, thank you for joining me. I must go and light the SE and warm stuff up and still work on the back of this room. Oh, the on-air lights come on. Look. Blow me down with a feather. I'm not going to touch it. I'm going to leave it going, I think. I don't know how much juice it takes, but it's going. Did you notice that? I imagine you all noticed that, did you? Right. See you when the channel resumes in the autumn. What do you mean, see the channel? We haven't finished the book yet. We've still got a couple more pages. What's he on about, Turbo Stream? Are you off somewhere? See you all when the channel resumes. Is he off? I can't. Anyway, catch you all later. Sorry about the duff reading. I've just been a bit tired, full of dust and stressed. But there we go. Anyway, take care and see you next time. See you tomorrow. Bye for now.